The United States has launched what Russia and Iran are calling an act of illegal aggression against the sovereign nation of Venezuela. Reuters reports U.S. strikes hit Caracas and the states of Miranda, Aragua, and La Guaira in the early hours of Saturday morning. President Donald Trump subsequently claimed that Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro and First Lady Cilia Flores had been captured and flown out of the country. Trump claims Maduro and Cilia Flores were captured. Caracas says it has no clarity on their whereabouts and demands proof of life. Russia's foreign ministry immediately condemned what it called an act of armed aggression. Iran called it a textbook example of aggression that violates the fundamental principles of the United Nations Charter. Even Colombia, which does not recognize Maduro's government, rejected the aggression against the sovereignty of Venezuela and of Latin America. Critics say the strikes raise serious questions under international law. The U.S. has not publicly detailed its legal basis for the operation. Russia was among the first to condemn the American strikes. The Russian Foreign Ministry issued a statement calling the operation an act of armed aggression and warning against further escalation. The pretexts cited to justify these actions are untenable, the ministry said. Ideologically driven hostility has prevailed over practical pragmatism and a willingness to build relations based on trust and predictability. This assessment reflects Moscow's view that Washington has abandoned diplomacy in favor of military force. Moscow called for restraint and dialogue, saying it was ready to support diplomatic efforts to resolve the crisis peacefully. We reaffirm our solidarity with the Venezuelan people and our support for the course pursued by its Bolivarian leadership to defend the country's national interests and sovereignty, the ministry declared. Russia also demanded clarity on President Maduro's whereabouts. The foreign ministry said his capture would represent an unacceptable encroachment on the sovereignty of an independent state. Russia's embassy in Caracas said it is operating as usual and remains in constant contact with Venezuelan authorities. It did not report any Russian citizens as having been injured. Iran issued an equally forceful condemnation. The Iranian Foreign Ministry described the American strikes as a blatant violation of Venezuela's sovereignty and territorial integrity. The U.S. military attack on Venezuela constitutes a clear violation of the fundamental principles of the United Nations Charter and the basic rules of international law, particularly Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the Charter, which prohibits the use of force, Iran stated. Tehran called the strikes a textbook example of an act of aggression that must be explicitly condemned immediately by the United Nations and by all states concerned with upholding the rule of law, peace, and international security. Iran reaffirmed Venezuela's inherent right to defend its sovereignty, territorial integrity, and right to self-determination. It emphasized the legal and moral responsibility of all states and the UN Security Council to act immediately. The solidarity between Iran and Venezuela reflects a broader pattern. Nations that have faced American pressure understand that they share common interests in defending the principle of sovereignty. The strikes began around 2 a.m. local time. Residents and local outlets reported multiple blasts in Caracas over approximately 90 minutes, Reuters says. Residents reported aircraft sounds and flashes over the Venezuelan capital. According to Venezuelan Defense Minister Vladimir Padrino López, the strikes impacted populated areas across multiple states. Authorities are still attempting to assess casualties. This invasion represents the greatest outrage the country has suffered, López declared, vowing that Venezuela would resist the presence of foreign troops. The Venezuelan government confirmed that strikes hit not only Caracas, but also the neighboring states of Miranda, Aragua, and La Guaira. Colombia's President Gustavo Petro released an even longer list of locations that he said had been hit. Venezuelan officials described the strikes as hitting populated areas. Independent damage details remain unclear at this hour. Venezuela has demanded proof that President Maduro and First Lady Flores are alive. Vice President Delcy Rodriguez told state television that the government had lost contact with the President and First Lady and did not have clarity on their whereabouts. "We demand that the United States provide proof of life," Rodriguez said, adding that Venezuela's defenses had been activated. The Venezuelan government issued a statement rejecting, repudiating, and denouncing the American strikes. It accused Washington of attempting to impose what it called a colonial war and force regime change. The government invoked the struggles of Simón Bolívar against Spanish colonial rule 2 centuries ago, framing the American action as the greatest violation of Venezuelan sovereignty since the Wars of Independence. The government called on the Venezuelan people to resist and vowed that the Bolivarian Revolution would not be defeated by foreign aggression. The American justification for these strikes has faced scrutiny. Trump has claimed that President Maduro is behind the Tren de Aragua gang and involved in drug trafficking. However, reports say U.S. intelligence assessments disputed key parts of the administration's narco claims. The U.S. has not publicly released evidence for its claims that Maduro ran a narco state. U.S. data shows that the majority of narcotics entering the United States come from Colombia and Mexico. The United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime has not identified Venezuela as a cocaine-producing country. Caracas and its allies call the narco state claim a pretext. Washington says it is a counter-narcotics operation. Maduro's camp says the operation was an oil grab. The U.S. frames it as counter-narcotics and law enforcement. Venezuela is widely cited as holding the world's largest proven oil reserves, often estimated around 300 billion barrels or more. That is more than Saudi Arabia, more than Russia, more than any other country. Multiple outlets report that Trump advisor Stephen Miller said the U.S. created Venezuela's oil industry, sparking backlash and oil grab accusations from Caracas and its allies. International law is clear on this point. Sovereign states own the natural resources within their territories under the principle of permanent sovereignty over natural resources. Venezuela nationalized its oil industry in 1976. The question of whether oil or counter-narcotics is the true motivation will be debated for years. What is certain is that Venezuela possesses resources that major powers covet. The Venezuelan opposition has been divided on the question of foreign intervention. Opposition leader Maria Corina Machado, a Nobel Peace Prize laureate, has argued that the opposition won the disputed election and has called for international pressure against the Maduro government. Some polls have suggested Venezuelans oppose foreign military intervention, though figures vary by pollster and methodology. The question of whether ordinary Venezuelans welcome or oppose American military action is complex and contested. What is clear is that millions of Venezuelans have fled the country in recent years, nearly 8 million according to UN estimates. Those who remain have suffered from economic crisis, shortages, and political instability. The Venezuelan people have endured enormous hardship. Whether American military action will alleviate or compound that suffering remains to be seen. Even Colombia condemned the American strikes. This is significant. Colombia does not recognize the Maduro government. Colombia has been aligned with Washington on Venezuelan policy. Colombia itself has faced pressure from Trump over migration issues, yet President Gustavo Petro's government said that Colombia rejects the aggression against the sovereignty of Venezuela and of Latin America. This statement reflects a broader concern across Latin America, that American military action against any country in the region threatens the sovereignty of all. Cuba also condemned the strikes. Most of the world has been relatively muted in its response so far. Tonight's assault followed months of escalating American military activity in the Caribbean. Reuters reports the U.S. carried out more than 24 strikes on vessels it alleges were tied to drug trafficking, with 110 or more fatalities since September. The Trump administration claimed these vessels were operated by narco-terrorists. However, the administration has not presented public evidence of drugs on board or proof that those killed belong to criminal organizations. Caracas claims civilians were among the victims. Washington says the targets were drug trafficking vessels. In December, the U.S. seized 2 ships carrying Venezuelan oil. Last week, American forces struck a facility inside Venezuelan territory, what Trump described as a dock used for drug trafficking. Each escalation brought the region closer to tonight's events. Critics say the strikes raise serious questions under international law. Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the United Nations Charter explicitly prohibits the use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. There are only two exceptions: self-defense against armed attack, or authorization by the UN Security Council. Neither appears to apply here. Venezuela did not attack the United States. The Security Council did not authorize military action. The US has not publicly detailed its legal basis for the operation. Attorney General Pam Bondi announced that Maduro has been indicted on drug trafficking charges in New York. But indictments do not authorize military strikes against sovereign nations under international law. Iran correctly identified the legal issue. The UN Charter was written to prevent powerful nations from using force against weaker ones. Whether those rules will be enforced is another question. Russia has drawn a clear line on the question of Maduro's capture. The Russian Foreign Ministry stated that the capture of President Maduro would represent an unacceptable encroachment on the sovereignty of an independent state. Moscow demanded clarity on Maduro's whereabouts. The principle at stake, from Russia's perspective, is whether any nation can simply seize the leader of another nation based on its own domestic indictments. Russia's embassy in Caracas confirmed that it is operating as usual and remains in constant contact with Venezuelan authorities. No Russian citizens were reported injured. The embassy's continued operation signals that Moscow is not abandoning its ally. Russia has significant investments in Venezuela and views the country as strategically important. Russia had reportedly supplied Venezuela with air defense systems. A Russian lawmaker claimed Russia delivered Pantsir S-1 and Buk M-2E systems by Il-76 transport aircraft in October. The shipment details were not independently confirmed. These are sophisticated weapons capable of intercepting aircraft and missiles. Whether they were deployed, whether they engaged American aircraft, and whether they succeeded or failed, all of this remains unknown at this hour. The American military's ability to strike across Venezuela suggests either that air defenses were not effective, or that they were not positioned to defend against this particular operation. Venezuela has vowed to resist. Defense Minister Vladimir Padrino López declared that his country would fight against the presence of foreign troops. This invasion represents the greatest outrage the country has suffered, he said. Whether Venezuela can mount meaningful military resistance is uncertain. The United States has assembled a massive force in the Caribbean, the largest deployment in the region in decades, led by the USS Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group. But resistance can take many forms. The Bolivarian movement has deep roots in Venezuelan society. The armed forces have remained loyal to the government through years of crisis. Maduro has claimed militia mobilizations in the millions. Independent tallies vary and are disputed. What is certain is that any foreign occupation would face challenges beyond the initial military operation. For Latin America, analysts say this represents the darkest hour since the Cold War interventions. The United States has a long history of intervention in the region. The CIA backed coups in Guatemala in 1954 and Chile in 1973. American forces invaded Panama in 1989 and Grenada in 1983. In recent decades, direct American military intervention in Latin America had become less common. Some observers believed the era of gunboat diplomacy had ended. Tonight's events challenge that assumption. The message to governments across the region is that American military power remains a factor in hemispheric politics. For governments that have pursued policies independent of Washington, in Mexico, Colombia, Brazil, and elsewhere, this is a significant development. American government war games had reportedly predicted difficulties from removing Maduro. According to reports citing the Council on Foreign Relations, simulations projected that removing the Venezuelan government could result in prolonged instability. Venezuela's institutions have been weakened by years of economic crisis, including the effects of American sanctions. There is no consensus successor to Maduro. The opposition is fragmented. The military's loyalty in a post-Maduro scenario is uncertain. A sudden collapse could trigger additional refugee flows beyond the nearly 8 million who have already fled. It could unleash competition between armed factions. It could create opportunities for criminal organizations. Christopher Sabatini of Chatham House warned that the U.S. military action will likely require sustained engagement of some sort, regardless of the outcome. The United Nations faces limitations in responding to these events. Iran called on the Security Council to act immediately against what it described as illegal U.S. aggression. But the U.S. can veto Security Council action, making a binding resolution unlikely. Russia and China will certainly condemn the American strikes. They may introduce resolutions. But those resolutions face the American veto. This is the structural reality of the post-World War II order. Permanent Security Council members can block institutional responses to their own actions. Nations around the world are watching and assessing the implications. If the United States can strike Venezuela and potentially remove its president based on domestic indictments, what does that mean for the principle of sovereignty more broadly? Cuba, which has faced American pressure for decades, will draw its own conclusions. Nicaragua, which has been sanctioned by Washington, faces similar questions. Bolivia experienced political upheaval in 2019 that its government attributed to foreign interference. Beyond Latin America, the implications extend to any nation that has charted a course independent of Washington. Iran, which has faced decades of sanctions, sees parallels. China, which the U.S. views as a strategic competitor, takes note. The American action in Venezuela is not just about Venezuela. It is a data point about how major powers behave in the current international system. The Bolivarian Revolution faces its greatest test. Hugo Chavez came to power in 1999 with a vision of using Venezuela's oil wealth for social programs, challenging American influence, and building solidarity with other nations of the global South. That project has faced enormous obstacles, economic difficulties, falling oil prices, and sustained American economic pressure through sanctions. Nicolás Maduro continued the Bolivarian project against significant external pressure. Now, if Trump's claims are accurate, he has been removed from the country by American forces. Whether the movement Chavez built can survive, whether it can adapt to these circumstances, will be determined in the coming days and weeks. If Trump's account is accurate, this would be among the most extreme U.S. interventions in the region in decades. The United States has captured foreign leaders before: Saddam Hussein after the Iraq invasion, Manuel Noriega after the Panama invasion. But those followed declared military operations with ground troops. The claimed capture of Maduro, if confirmed, would represent a different model: a strike operation to seize a head of state without a traditional invasion. The full details of what occurred remain unclear. Venezuela has not confirmed Maduro's capture. The U.S. has not released operational details. Much remains unknown. The world now waits to see what comes next. Will Venezuela confirm or deny Maduro's capture? Will the United States provide proof of life as Venezuela demands? Will there be continued military operations or an attempt at stabilization? Trump is expected to give a news conference at Mar-a-Lago. More details may emerge then. Vice President Delcy Rodriguez is constitutionally next in line if Maduro has indeed been removed. Other senior figures include Interior Minister Diosdado Cabello and Military Chief General Vladimir Padrino López. The coming hours will be decisive for Venezuela and significant for the broader questions of international law and sovereignty that this action has raised. The international response so far has been divided. Russia has condemned the strikes as armed aggression. Iran has called them a textbook violation of the UN Charter. Cuba has condemned the action. Colombia, despite not recognizing Maduro, rejected aggression against the sovereignty of Venezuela and Latin America. Most other nations have been relatively muted. Whether that changes in the coming days, as more details emerge and as the UN Security Council meets, remains to be seen. What is clear is that tonight's events have raised fundamental questions about the international order, questions that will not be resolved quickly or easily. The fate of Venezuela hangs in the balance. Millions of ordinary Venezuelans, already suffering from years of crisis, now face additional uncertainty. The country's political future is unclear. The humanitarian situation may worsen before it improves. Beyond Venezuela, the principle of sovereignty itself has been challenged. The rules that were supposed to govern relations between states have been tested. Russia says the pretexts were untenable. Iran says this was a textbook act of aggression. The US says it was a counter-narcotics operation against a narco-state. The truth and the consequences will emerge in the days, weeks, and months ahead. The world is watching.